Pokémon Origins is a mini-series that was released in 2013. Unlike the main Pokémon anime, this series more closely follows the events of the first game. In this video, I'll review each episode, give it a score out of 5, and then talk about the show in general at the end. Also, just a quick side note, the episodes are called files for some reason. Well, that's pretty much it, so without any further ado, every episode of Pokémon Origins reviewed. File 1, Red. Red and his rival Blue, green in Japan, are sent on a mission by Professor Oak to find every Pokémon in the region and load its data into a Pokédex. There are two trends that you'll hear me mention throughout this review, and the first one is the incredibly clever use of game mechanics throughout the show. The first one obviously being how they transform the game's opening scene to essentially serve the same purpose for the show. It's pretty short, and the following Nidorino vs Gengar fight is another, admittedly less clever nod to the games. I'll talk about it more as we go on, but I really like how Red is characterized here. The games have you play as an extremely confident kid, and the show really captures that energy. After ditching his mom, Red meets up with Oak's grandson, who I'll be calling Blue for the rest of this review. The decision to hold off on having Red fight Blue in the lab seems odd at first, but it really makes sense thematically for the episode later. Anyway, the catching sequence is pretty neat, nothing special, but I do like how they give Charmander emotions to match Red. Eventually he catches up to Blue, and they fight for the first time in the series. The fight is just one Pokemon each, which most of the fights in the show end up being anyway, but there's still a lot to enjoy here. The action itself is relatively mediocre, especially considered to some of the more grandiose fights that happen in the following episodes, but the thematic importance of Red getting his butt kicked is really well done. Red, in this series, doesn't aspire to become the world's best trainer from the beginning, and instead only desiring to fill his Pokédex. This dynamic really only lasts a few minutes, but it's pretty clever in how it leads into the plot. The point of this first episode is mainly just to show how Red needs to learn that his Pokemon are his partners and not just a tool for battle. Also, they do a fantastic job in this episode of making Blue an arrogant jerk. The Brock stuff in this episode is just okay though. It's not really as deep as the show wants you to believe, but it's still fairly enjoyable. Skipping past some more clever game references, we get to the gym. The two kids guarding Brock's gym are easily my favorite part of the episode. The way they just talk down to Red is hilarious, and the reactions to Brock and Red's battle are great. This part in particular, where the girl mimics the in-game text, is really funny.
Not very effective.
Speaking of the fight, while the lead-in is just a little bit too much, there's a lot of good here. Red just throwing everything against the wall gives the fight a nice feeling of desperation. Also, the sense that he's learning and adapting throughout the battle is nice, even if he ends up just using Charmander against Onix anyway. The use of String Attack is really clever for the show, and the fight ends in a really satisfying way, despite it only featuring relatively weak Pokemon. The episode ends with Red running off and the two characters giving monologues about him. Brock's is up first, and it's relatively boring. It's a nice end to Brock's part in the show, which is a much more serious take on the gym leader than the main anime, but it's nothing too special. Oaks, on the other hand, sets up the rest of the series as it details the conflict between Blue and Red. The kids from Pallet Town are a great opposite of each other, and this monologue does a great job describing that. Overall, this episode is a pretty good setup. Red's lack of any really strong Pokemon keeps them from being able to do any really great battles, but their callbacks to the games are neat, the Brock stuff is relatively well done, and the Blue-Red conflict gets started on the right foot. File 2, Cubone. Red battles Team Rocket and a mysterious ghost inside Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town. The intro brings us to the second recurring theme of this review, the fact that the show is just plain rushed. Instead of doing a bunch of shorter stories, the show opts to cover the 30-hour game by doing recaps at the beginning of each episode, and sometimes in the middle. I really don't blame them for doing this, but it's really weird just to see Misty get a quick mention, and Red's first encounter with Team Rocket to not be fully shown. The montage is fairly fun though. The episode starts off with a conversation in the Poke Center between Red and a few random people. This scene is a bit too long and lacks much substance, but at least the hand on the shoulder bit is one of the best callbacks to the game. I would have liked to see this episode go from more of a horror angle like it kind of teases at the beginning, but instead it chooses to focus on the emotional implications of Pokemon death. Red eventually runs into a new character named Reina. The show has very few unique characters to call its own, and unfortunately, Reina is still incredibly basic. She has about 0 interesting characteristics and does very little to push the plot forward. Eventually, she does tell Cubone's emotional backstory, which is surprisingly well done. Cubone's cries after his mother is murdered in front of him are really dark, and it's sad enough to fit the episode's need. While the idea that a 10-year-old is the best chance of taking back the tower doesn't work as well as it does in the games, it does work well to give Blue an incentive to also get into the tower. The argument between the people of Lavender Town about whether or not they should save Mr. Fuji is also written fairly well. After Blue's little monologue to himself, we get a fantastic remix of the Lavender Town theme. The fake out with the ghost girl is probably the spookiest part of the episode, but unfortunately, it doesn't really go anywhere. Back to the blue stuff, it also never really goes anywhere and feels completely pointless in the episode. I thought they would take the blue versus red fight in the tower from the game to make that the first great fight of the series, but instead, we just have blue fight the rocket grunt off screen. This does lead to the best scene of the episode, which is Cubone reuniting with his mother. While Reina and Red's presence threatens to ruin the moment, they let it play out and it's pretty stellar. Red's encounter with Team Rocket is the only moment of the episode that can be argued as even a fight. The lack of an even okay fight in this episode is really what holds it back, as the emotional moments are just too far and in between to carry the episode. Jolteon just one-hits the coughing after Marowak breaks the rule of battle and makes it a 2v1. Red's meeting with Fuji is pretty decent, but there really isn't much this episode to separate Fuji and Oak as characters, as they're both just old men who serve as mentors to Red. The Megastone and ring set up nicely for the end of the series, and Red's departure from the town is heartwarming enough. Overall, this episode has enough emotional moments to make it a good episode, but fails to either commit to being an emotional episode or feature a fight to fit the tone. File 3. Giovanni. After infiltrating the Sylph Company, Red challenges the leader of Team Rocket, Giovanni. After yet another montage of, wow, these stories would have made for some sick episodes, the show leads us straight into the most intense scene of the show yet. Red and Blue saving the secretary of the Sylph Company is a bit of a jolt to start the main portion of the episode, but the torturing Pokemon angle of the story is a great motivator to point Red as the hero of the show. The next scene is a bit off, as 1, Blue refusing to help was a bit too far for his character, and 2, this moment doesn't exactly come off as I'm sure the show intended. The first fighting of Giovanni is actually really well done though. While this episode isn't the first of the series to have Red lose in the first half to set up a second half fight, it does do it a lot better than the first episode did. Giovanni gets massively softened up later in the episode, but for this scene he is stone cold as he obliterates Charizard and berates Red. Some of the shots during this scene look fantastic too, and Giovanni's monologue continues the theme of Pokemon as partners instead of tools. After this, we get yet another montage that leads us into Red taking on the final gym challenge. These two scenes before the near 10-minute fight are a bit hit or miss. Some things I like them not building up the surprise that Giovanni is the 8th gym leader, but other things, like Blue defeating Giovanni before Red, kinda downplay the battle. Obviously Blue being ahead of Red is a major part of their character dynamic, but it's still an unfortunate consequence. Anyway, enough about lame character dynamics and boring clever writing, let's talk about Pokemon fighting each other. Seriously though, this fight is easily the first great fight of the series. Red refusing to battle Giovanni as a gym leader is a great choice for the show to take, as it allows for some really clever writing. Giovanni deciding to battle Red 2v6 in order to go all out seems like a strange choice, but it allows for Red to get pummeled for the first part of the fight. While I would have liked to see Red win this battle through any actual strategy, it was nice to see that he at least learned some stuff about type matchups, even if he ends up relying on Charizard anyway. The actual action choreography throughout this fight is pretty impressive, and it makes for some really fun action to watch. Throughout this fight, we get some Giovanni monologues, as the show really differs from the games. Giovanni slowly realizing that he was once like Red is a bit slow, but he's still a great character. While I imagine this would have hit harder if it wasn't his first episode, it still makes for a pretty clever way to wrap up his story in a single episode. The end of the battle is great for multiple reasons, the first of which being how cinematic it's written. Having Hitmonlee take out Rhyhorn sets up a great one-on-one with Charizard. The use of Seismic Toss as a counter looks really nice and makes a lot of in-game sense, and finishes the well-choreographed fight with a well-choreographed ending. Giovanni getting redeemed despite his massive abuse of Pokemon is a bit unsettling, but his line about taking the gym badge from the leader of Viridian City instead of the president of Team Rocket is a nice moment. The ending sets up episode 4 well and then concludes the file. Overall, this episode is pretty hard to judge. While there are certainly some problems and troubling moments, it's hard not to call it a good episode because of how cinematic certain moments are. Giovanni's arc is pretty solid for only being in one episode, and the blue stuff is short enough to be negligible. The fight is action-wise great, and the show tackles Team Rocket's downfall in a different but clever way. But the show gets in its own way at times and tries to be more than it is. File 4. Charizard. Red challenges the Elite Four and learns of 150th Pokemon. Just so I don't have to keep repeating myself, before starting this review, I'll go ahead and mention the musical and visual bump that this episode got. I've heard that the best staff from the main anime just worked on this episode, and is shown in the stellar choreography and animation style. The show just looks and sounds a lot better in this episode than the other three. This file starts off with a slightly less rushed recap, this time of Red's Elite Four challenge. While having 4 of the biggest in-game fights be off-screen is a bit underwhelming, I get that they couldn't have 6 good battles in one episode. Lance gets a bit more time than the rest, but he's still quickly brushed aside for the first major fight of the episode. I guess calling it a major fight is a bit of a stretch, as most of the fight is again just recapped. This is actually really weird, as the animation looks so nice in the small segments that we get to see, but we really only get to see Blastoise versus Charizard in full. That's right, despite being the main focus of the last fight, the show still insists of having Charizard finish this one. And they call back to the first episode, where Red learns that he needs to utilize type matchups to his advantage. Red not only chooses a fire type against Blastoise, but then chooses to only pick a fire type move, which inexplicably one-hits. This is definitely a lame way to end the Red-Blue feud, and Oak just bullying Blue for longer than the actual fight wasn't exactly necessary either. Despite Blue not having to fight a champion, which implies that he was the first, they still added portraits to the Hall of Fame. It's a nice detail, but probably not worth the plot hole. This fight is arguably the most important part of the original game, and the fact that they decided to limit it to the first 8 minutes is mind-boggling. That section ends abruptly, and we get the second part of the episode, which focuses on Red's journey to complete his Pokédex. After a relatively short montage, which does feature a few fantastic shots, Red's celebration gets cut short by Blue getting destroyed by Blastoise landing on him. Speaking of piling on Blue, this whole episode seems hellbent on it. It also destroys his Pokédex, which somehow had all 149 Pokémon, despite the legendary birds being unique, but who cares. The return of Fuji and Reina is handled really well, as their dynamic is portrayed pretty decently throughout their short scenes. I've already mentioned this a bit before, but Oak is just infuriating this episode. He's demeaning to Blue, who is literally 10 and almost just died, and he takes 10 years explaining anything to Red. I also don't get why Fuji didn't just tell Red to give Charizard the stone, but I guess sometimes you just need some plot convenience. Real quick, before getting to the Mewtwo fight, I know I said I wouldn't keep repeating it, but these two shots are utterly fantastic. Anyway, into the main fight, it again quickly devolves into a 1v1, this time with Charizard versus Mewtwo. Not much happens before they're shoved into the water, except that Red runs under Charizard to break his fall. Like, Charizard is over 200 pounds, and Red just heard that Blastoise almost killed Blue, but he still ran to have Charizard fall on top of him. After that, though, we get the best scene of the entire series. I don't care that it's just an advertisement for Pokemon X, but Charizard Mega Evolving and emerging from the water with Red right as the music picks up is such a fantastic moment. The choreography here is terrific, and watching the massively powerful Mewtwo get punished by the incredibly cool looking Mega Charizard X makes for a really fun scene. The ending makes for a good, the journey continues moment, and seeing Mew was cool, but the fallout from Mewtwo's capture isn't really felt. Overall, the episode's incredible music, animation, and choreography should make it a truly fantastic episode, but it struggles from what the series struggled from most. It just feels really rushed. Every moment feels like it happens in the blink of an eye. Overall, while this episode is great, it feels too fast to be considered truly fantastic. And that's the last episode. As usual, since this is a single season show, this will double as the season and series overview. To start off, the animation looks good in the first 3 episodes and then looks immaculate in episode 4. The music is more consistently great, but still takes a step up in the last file. Reviewing the show is a bit different than reviewing normal shows since it was based on a different work. When it comes to how well it covers the games, it's hit or miss, but largely successful. Some stuff, like Brock changing his team to match Red's experience, adds context to the games. Other stuff, like both Blue and Red catching the legendary birds, just muddies the water. Despite only being 4 episodes, the show has 5 recap montages. This brings us to the series' largest problem, its inevitable rushing. It's most evident in episode 4, but it's present throughout all 90 minutes. The game has 2 main plots, defeating Team Rocket and becoming the champion. The show adds a 3rd final plot, completing the decks. What I would have done is kept episode 1 the same, combined episode 2 and 3 into one Team Rocket episode, and then split episode 4 into Elite 4 and then Mewtwo, but every episode has its highlights and its weak points, and doing this would kind of sacrifice some of the Reina and Fuji stuff. The show dabbles in showing some fantastic fights, but rarely commits. I know I've been only mentioning flaws, but I really do like a lot about this series. Red as a character is fantastic, and his bond with Charizard is portrayed very well. Fuji and Oak, at least in the first episode, are both great old mentor characters too. Reina is okay, but Blue is handled semi-poorly from episodes 2 to 4. His whole thing is that he's always been ahead of Red, but the show has Red overpower him in episodes 2 and 3, then has his grandfather bully him for 4 minutes, and then has his Blastoise fall on him and destroy everything he worked for. While Blue is a bit more miss than hit, the jokes in the episodes usually do hit and have some really funny Pokemon-specific jokes. The darker moments of the series work pretty well too, but I wish they kind of focused on them a bit more. The ones in the last episode are pretty great though. Well, there's only 4 episodes, so I'm not going to waste any more of your time and keep on repeating the same opinions, but it basically comes down to this. If you're a Pokemon fan, you'll definitely enjoy it. And if you aren't, it's got enough to still potentially be a good watch. For a rating, while it's tempting to go on the lower side, I'm actually going to give it a 7. The flaws do make for some painful moments, but a large part of the series is either mindless fun or clever adaptation. My favorite episode was File 4 Charizard, and my least favorite was File 3 Cubone. This is where I would usually ask you to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, but this one's a bit different from what I usually make, so it's really up to you. You can, however, follow me on Twitter and tell me why all of my opinions are bad. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you next time, which will hopefully likely be Gravity Falls Season 2. Thanks for watching.